In this lesson, we're going to talk about totals and subtotals in a pivot table. Now, pivot table by its nature sums up everything anyway. So usually when you create one, it's going to be good enough. But there are some settings with grand totals and subtotals on the fields in between that are good to be aware of. So you can change your pivot a little bit, tweak it a little bit if you need to. So let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to use a different data source today. This is the Northwind Traders database because it's a little bit bigger. It's got a little more things. And we're going to make a pivot table that looks like this. So let's just start off by, I'm going to go ahead and just delete this pivot table. Just highlight the some rows, right click on it, and do delete. And then we'll start off again. Now this time we're going to use just the table names. So we're just going to insert a pivot table. And for the table of range, it's T, Northwind, Traders. And an existing workbook, we're going to put it right there on A10 and we should be good. And there we go. Now we've got our structure. So let's build it up here a little bit. First thing we want to do is show customer name. And then we're going to have the categories below that. And then a product name. And then for value, we want sales. And then let's put the date in there. We're going to do order date across the top for columns. We'll expand that out so we get the months. And then I'm going to pull the years off so it looks a little cleaner. Okay. So now this is a pretty typical pivot table. It's summed up everything. And what we're going to be talking about here is totals and subtotals at the field level. So here we've got a customer, and then we've got categories, and here we've got dried apples and dried pears. So let's look over here in the pivot table. Here's our sales, 1,590 and 900, and there's a subtotal there, okay, 2,490. That's the sum of these two. And then there's a subtotal for candy and for beverages. Didn't sell any in June, so over here the subtotals for beverages. And then at the top level, we've got subtotals for the customers as well. So that seems pretty good. But that's a lot of subtotals, okay? Let me show you a couple things. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to collapse all the way up to customer. So I'm going to right click here and collapse to customer. No matter what happens when you collapse up to a field level, you will get the total of every point in that group of data. So this is showing us the totals for all the products for the Bright Dog customer. Now if I go down to Umba, I have categories, and then I have this category that has several products, and that's got my subtotal here, as well as at the top for the customer level. So it is pretty useful. Now, if I roll this one up individually, if I double click and roll it up, I'm still going to show that subtotal there. But what I want to show is that we can take the subtotals off when the pivot table is expanded, and it sometimes makes it easier to read that way. So the easiest thing to do here is go to our pivot table design tab, and we've got a subtotals button up on the ribbon. Now typically you can just say do not show subtotals at the bottom of the group or the top. So let's see what these do. If I do not show subtotals, that takes the subtotals off every field that we're using to distinguish our data. So it takes it off the customer, it takes it off the categories, but again it takes it off this category here. If I double click and roll this up, I still get the summation. It's just not showing a subtotal when all the other data is there. So let's see the other two options here. Show subtotals at the top of the group. And this makes sense. It puts on the same line as the customer here. But you also have the option to show subtotals at the bottom of the group. And that's interesting because that will keep the customer line completely blank. So it's kind of a delineator. But at the bottom, it's going to add a total for all of that. See there? Now, the other thing you might have noticed is we did subtotals at the bottom. Look at this. Every product category also got a subtotal at the bottom. So it can get a little busy. Now, the subtotals button is the easiest way to manage your subtotals on a pivot table. Just turn them on and off for all the categories that we're filtering and sorting by. That's good. But what if we want the subtotals on for the customer level, but maybe not the categories? So all you have to do there is click on the category field, and then if you right click it, we can pick up the field settings box. And that gives you a little more control here. In the field settings, we have a subtotals category, and initially it's automatic. That's basically Excel's just going to put a sum on everything you want to subtotal unless you tell it differently. I can also say none, where I don't want any subtotals, just for that one particular category. So look at this. We're going to have subtotals come off for all the categories here when I click OK. And now that's a little better. I still have a subtotal on for the customer, but I don't have all these subtotals for every category or every division in between. So that's kind of useful too. But now that one, you have to go in to the field settings and change that manually for that particular category or whatever it is you're sorting on. The other thing I want to show you that I don't think is very good, but I want to show you anyway, is if I go back to my field settings, you'll notice when I do custom, I can change the type of subtotal. So I could do a count as a subtotal instead. And now it's just saying I have 3 sales in this category. And these are the actual sale amounts. Could be useful. I kind of think it's a little confusing. Let me show you the last thing that's really confusing is if I go here, go to field settings, you can actually have multiple subtotals. You could have the sum, count, and average, and click OK there. Now, this just looks crazy to me because I'm summing up the dried fruit and nuts sum. I've got a total sales of that, and I had 3 sales, and I had an average of 288 per sale. But again, I want to show you that in case you get a pivot table that looks like this, you know you can turn them off. Now, if I collapse this field, it's going to go back to just doing the sum at the top because that's the basic aggregation. It's not going to put the multiple subtotals on the line when we collapse that field. Let's go ahead and just get rid of that. Now, we could go back and do the value field settings, but if I go to subtotals, I can just do not show them for all, and then if I want to show them again, show at the top of the group, those won't come back. The extra ones that we said earlier will not come back. So that's kind of it for subtotals. The other thing I want to show you real quick is grand totals, and most of the time you're always going to want grand totals on. That's the last column is showing the grand totals per customer, adding up all the months, and in the bottom row is showing the totals of all the customers for each individual month. So we can see what the sales are that way. Normally we'd want these on, but you also have a grand totals button where you can turn them off for rows and columns. Takes them both off. You can turn them on for rows only, or you can turn them on for columns only. So why would you want to do that? So if I'm looking at this data, having a grand total by customer kind of makes sense. I want to see what my grand total is per customer. But maybe since my customers are mixed, I don't need the grand total for rows. So I might take that off. It just helps when you're sending this pivot table out. If one of the grand totals is going to be confusing, that's one less thing people have to look at and get confused over. Another reason you might take grand totals off is that sometimes if you want to make a chart, if you have grand totals on, it can include those grand totals in the chart. But basically it's pretty simple. I mean, when you make your first pivot table, it's going to come up and it's going to aggregate things and put subtotals on the fields you put in. And then a lot of times the easiest thing to do is just to go in, take the subtotals, take them off for everything, and then go into that first level field and maybe put subtotals on just for that top level field. You can do automatic there. And then when I open up a field, I'll get subtotals for that customer there. All right, well, that's about it for subtotals and grand totals. Let's get ready for the next lesson.